Chapters 3 and 4 in Gerard Hauser's Introduction to Rhetorical Theory focus on rhetorical situations, arguments, and the burden of freedom. I'm pulling out those three aspects of these two chapters to emphasize. Hauser goes into a lot more detail in some other matters, but I'm going to pull these things out particularly because they have an impact on what we'll be studying all year or all semester in terms of rhetoric and its role in culture. In order to understand the concept of a rhetorical situation, Hauser provides us a definition of a situation as something that has emergence and relativity, that emerges and is relative. He says that when we have a situation, a meaningful situation, it goes through a transformation of time and a transformation of space. So originally we have chronological time, or we experience things chronologically. One thing happens, then another thing happens. And those things happen in certain physical spaces. He says that something undergoes a transformation when it becomes rhetorical. And that is that the time becomes psychological time and the space becomes social space. And the process that it goes through is described best by emergence and relativity. Now, in a week or two, we're going to be looking closely at Aristotle, and we'll look at the Greeks in the 5th century BCE, and they have a similar understanding of rhetoric, and particularly of the concept of time. And so these ideas are very old, and I think we can say either that they influenced us strongly, or that this is an aspect of reality that Westerners are interested in and want to talk about. So emergence is when time transforms, and about this Hauser says that events, processes happen across time. We don't gain meaning about those processes until we get some perspective on them, and then the meaning emerges. That depends on how things happen. So these events are dynamic and ever-changing, and the meaning about them emerges as a result. They emerge in part in relationship to this notion of relativity. He associates relativity with space, and I like that he's doing this because he's not talking about relativity in terms of ethical relativity specifically. Rather, he's talking about perceptual relativity. If we are standing in a particular place, we see things happening in certain ways. If we stand in another place, we'll see things happen in completely different ways and have different perspectives on that. A lot of things affect our perception of an event and our interpretation of the meaning of that event. In fact, he says that the opportunity for rhetoric arises in terms of, as he says on page 41, rhetoric provides the path to shared social space. It bridges the divide between our individual perspectives. So you see one thing, I see another. Rhetoric helps us come together and have a shared understanding at some point, a willingness to occupy the same space, if you will. He then turns to Lloyd Bitzer's understanding of the rhetorical situation, and I just want to say that Lloyd Bitzer's understanding is a very specific, narrow understanding of the rhetorical situation. Again, I think that it's helpful to understand Hauser as providing us a toolbox of sorts of ways of looking at this thing called rhetoric, because he's most interested in our being able to analyze and interpret. So this is what Hauser calls a functional understanding of the rhetorical situation. He quotes Bitzer. This is a quote from Bitzer quoted in Hauser. The rhetorical situation is a complex of persons, events, objects, and relations presenting an actual or potential exigence, which can be completely or partially removed if discourse introduced into the situation can so constrain human decision or action as to bring about the significant modification of exigence. As we'll find throughout the semester, each of these phrases has to be distilled in order for us to understand what's going on. So an exigence, according to Bitzer, is an imperfection marked by urgency. So when things are interrupted and made imperfect, made where they're not sufficient for us, if they are marked by urgency or an extreme need, then this gives rise to a rhetorical situation. So we don't have a rhetorical situation if we don't have an imperfection marked by urgency. Clearly, both the concept of an imperfection and the concept of urgency are dependent on perspective and relativity, or relative in perspective. In addition, Bitzer is very specific about what constitutes an audience. He says an audience is capable of being influenced by discourse and of being mediators of change. Audiences are not just people who happen across, who hear or listen. In order to be a rhetorical audience, we have to be capable of being influenced by discourse, so capable of being influenced. We have to be sentient, we have to be willing, all those things that would make us capable of influence. And we have to be, in addition, capable of being mediators of change. So we wouldn't normally think, for instance, of children as being audiences of rhetoric, because while they're easily influenced, they're not likely to be mediators of change. Typically powerless individuals we would not have in that situation, and also unconcerned individuals. The third concept that Bitzer equates with the rhetorical situation is the notion of constraints. So we have limits and opportunities, as he calls them, that affect the rhetorical situation. We might be in a courtroom, in which case we are limited by judicial rhetoric. If I am the President of the United States, then I have an opportunity to speak. So the State of the Union would be a rhetorical constraint for Barack Obama, because he has the opportunity to speak in that situation. So that is a constraint. Constraint sounds negative, but it isn't always a negative. Now, how do we evaluate rhetorical situations? I think that one of the things I'll be asking you this semester is to talk about success. How can we determine the success of a rhetorical event? Bitzer and Hauser both say that fitting response, not only can discourse affect the exigence, but the situation calls for deliberate communicative response. Hauser's very interested in this notion that it's not just that an exigence occurs and that we have an audience and limits and opportunities, but that we should respond to those situations. And a fitting response has got to be appropriate. He makes reference to the term prepon, which we will look at down the road when we look at Aristotle, in terms of determining what is fitting. He also seems to want to include in this fitting category the requirement to speak at certain times, that there are certain times when we should speak, and that it is fitting that we speak, so that we're called upon. And if we fail to do that, that is not a fitting response. So he wants to talk about fitting as opposed to success. Success being actually changing minds or actions. In addition, he introduces us to Henry Johnstone and his notion of unilateral and bilateral arguments. For philosophers, and Johnstone is a philosopher, the concept of an argument is, again, a very specific thing. It's not the generic sense of the term of disagreement. Johnstone, who will later theorize ethical rhetoric, will have a lot to say about what constitutes the situation of a fitting rhetorical response, and then also just a rhetorical response. Interestingly enough, like Aristotle, Johnstone puts the emphasis on audience. And in fact, this is one of the things I like about Hauser, is that he draws together quite a few arguments about audiences. Johnstone says in order to have a real argument, a legitimate argument, the audience who hears the argument has to be beyond our control, our being the speaker. The audience has to be free to ignore, disbelieve, or refute the argument. And both arguer and audience have to have an interest in the argument. They have to have something to gain or lose, some involvement in it. Now, this is interesting because we often don't emphasize the freedom of the audience. I think it is clear in Johnstone's mind, if your audience is a group of people you have under your immediate control, then you're not making an argument, because only audiences who are free, who are unfettered by our control and are able to ignore our argument, to disagree with it, to stand up and respond to it, only those people are legitimately considered an argument. In addition, we have to have folks who are interested in the event, or we don't have an argument. So the argument, notice he's not emphasizing the text or the body of that, but rather the relationship between speaker and audience. Now, finally, Hauser leaves us with this quotation, which I really like because it's something that I think is something that Hauser emphasizes, that I emphasize as well, and that is that rhetoric culls us. Rhetoric makes us take on the burden of freedom. He sees that civic responsibility, that open space, the space where we can disagree, as not just a privilege, but as a responsibility. And that rhetoric or rhetorical situations not only invite us to respond, but demand that we respond. And that the failure to respond is as much of a problem as responding inappropriately. I'd like us to really think about this. There's much in Hauser that I don't particularly disagree with. I think that some of these definitions, Bitzer's understanding of the rhetorical situation, for instance, can be helpful. It can help us understand and get a handle on an event. But I don't think they are necessarily final concepts. This is one that I think deserves a lot of attention, because it's one that I think is at the heart of a democratic sort of environment, which is the responsibility not only of speakers, but of audiences, once they hear, to respond to arguments. And that rhetoric is this ongoing sort of process that we have to continually be open to and continually be willing to participate in. Now, there's a lot in chapters 3 and 4, particularly in chapter 4, that I haven't discussed. And these ideas are interesting, and I encourage you to use them if they inspire you for analysis. But the concepts that I've pulled out in this lecture are the ones that are most important to me. I look forward to seeing you in class.